She strained the bacon grease through cheesecloth into a coffee can, not knowing that 70 years later, people would pay good money to learn what she already knew for free. Every trick in this kitchen was designed to stretch $1 until it screamed. In the postwar years, an American family could easily spend a quarter to a third of everything they earned just on food. That number sounds impossible now, but it shaped every habit in a 1950s kitchen. From the grease can by the stove to the sour milk, nobody dared pour down the drain. This was not poverty. This was a whole generation raised by scarcity, cooking in a decade of new abundance. Most of what we think of as a 1950s trick was not invented in the 1950s at all. It came out of the Depression and then out of the ration books of the Second World War, and it simply never left. The women running kitchens in 1953 had learned to cook from mothers who had learned to cook with almost nothing. The habit stayed even after the shortages ended. During the war, families carried ration books and counted stamps for sugar, meat, and butter. Government offices printed pamphlets teaching women how to cook without ingredients that used to be assumed. When rationing finally ended in the mid-1940s, the pamphlets kept circulating and the habits kept getting taught, mother to daughter, because nobody trusted abundance to last. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Save the fat. Every kitchen kept a can by the stove, and every bit of bacon grease or roast drippings went straight into it instead of the trash. It was not just about money. That saved fat carried flavor a bottle of plain oil never could. That grease can was doing something modern cooking oil simply cannot do. Bacon fat and roast drippings carry smoke compounds and browned protein flavor that plain vegetable oil never picks up. Cornbread fried in saved bacon. Fat tastes different from cornbread made with oil from a bottle, and it is not nostalgia talking. It is chemistry a 1950s homemaker understood without ever naming it that way. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. Rendered fat fell out of fashion for two reasons that had nothing to do with safety. Vegetable shortening companies advertised harder and more often, and decades later, cholesterol concerns made animal fat sound frightening. Neither reason had much to do with how the grease can actually performed in a skillet, which was, quite simply, better than what replaced it. Milk that had gone slightly sour was not poured out. It was used. Clabbered or soured milk, thick and tangy, was folded into biscuit dough and pancake batter as the acid partner for baking soda, giving both a lighter rise and a deeper flavor. A homemaker in 1953 saw a carton on the turn and thought biscuits, not waste. This is the part that surprises people most. We are trained today to see expired milk as pure loss, something to dump down the sink the moment it smells off. A 1950s kitchen treated the early stage of souring milk as an ingredient with its own job to do. It only became waste once it crossed a line she knew by smell, not by a date printed on a carton. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. A pound of ground beef in a 1950s kitchen rarely stood alone. Oats, breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, even cooked rice went into meatloaf and meatballs, stretching 1 pound of meat into a dinner that could feed a family of 6 instead of 3. This trick traced straight back to the Depression and never let go. Betty Crocker's Picture. Cookbook, published in 1950 and sitting on countless kitchen counters that decade, is full of recipes built around this exact stretching technique. Meatloaf was not a joke or a punishment in that era. It was a genuinely clever answer to a real budget problem. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching. Stale bread was never simply thrown away. A hardening loaf became bread pudding, French toast, or was dried and crushed into breadcrumbs for coating chicken or stuffing a Sunday bird. Nothing with any use left in it went into the trash can without a fight. There was a wartime phrase that outlived the war by a decade. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. It started as a home front slogan during the Second World War, but the habit it described did not end when the fighting did. It simply became how a whole generation of American homemakers ran a kitchen, quietly, without ever needing to say the slogan out loud again. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget. Vinegar and water, sometimes with a little baking soda worked in, was the standard all-purpose cleaner in most homes for decades before dedicated spray cleaners took over store shelves in the 1960s and 70s. It scrubbed counters, cut grease, and rinsed produce, all from one cheap brown bottle. Refrigerators changed everything, and they changed it fast. In 1940, fewer than half of American homes had one. By the early 1950s, ownership had climbed toward the vast majority of households, and that single appliance rewired how leftovers, dairy, and fat were kept and reused. The grease can and the icebox habits of an older generation did not vanish. They just moved into a colder box. Before the refrigerator arrived in most homes, and often even after, a cold pantry or root cellar did the same job for free. An unheated closet, a cellar corner, or a box built into an outside wall kept potatoes, onions, apples, and jars of canned goods cool without using a single watt of electricity. Sitting quietly beside the new fridge, many families were just starting to trust. Home canning was not fading away in the 1950s the way people assume. It had peaked during the war years, when victory gardens covered backyards from coast to coast, and it was still a common practice through the early and middle part of the decade. The real decline came later, through the 1960s and 70s, as supermarkets and freezers made shelf jars feel unnecessary. During the war, an estimated 20 million American households planted a victory garden, growing a meaningful share of the country's fresh vegetables in backyards, vacant lots, and even city rooftops. Many of those garden beds did not disappear when the war ended. Families kept planting them into the early 1950s simply because homegrown food was still cheaper than anything sold at the market. The United States Department of Agriculture published a guide in 1959 called Family Fare, aimed directly at homemakers who needed to stretch a food budget without sacrificing nutrition. It was not folk wisdom passed down by guesswork. Home economics had become a real academic discipline by this decade, taught in land-grant universities, tested and refined like any other applied science. It is easy to picture the 1950s homemaker as simply repeating what her mother did without much thought behind it. That picture is wrong. Extension bulletins from this era often included exact cost per serving comparisons between a stretched dish and an unstretched one, essentially teaching a whole country to budget a meal down to the penny, decades before anyone called it a budget recipe. Coffee grounds and eggshells rarely made it to the trash bin either. In households that kept even a small garden plot, used grounds and crushed shells went straight into the soil or the chicken feed, a quiet, unglamorous version of what people now call a zero-waste kitchen. Nobody in 1953 needed a label for it. It was simply how you ran a household. Not every 1950s innovation was about stretching food further. Some were about keeping it fresher in the first place. A businesswoman named Brownie Wise pioneered the home party sales model for a plastic container line starting in 1951, and its burping seal kept leftovers from spoiling as quickly, which meant less food thrown out at the end of the week. That home party model spread almost entirely through women's own social networks, neighbor to neighbor, rather than through a magazine advertisement or a store display. It is a small detail, but it says something real about how kitchen knowledge and kitchen tools moved through this decade. Word of mouth between women running households was often more powerful than anything printed in an ad. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 brought a second, quieter wave of scarcity anxiety into American kitchens right as the decade began. Some commodities saw price controls again, and a homemaker who thought the hard years were behind her found herself tightening the budget once more. The 1950s were never one flat decade of easy plenty from start to finish. By the middle of the decade, something new started appearing on grocery shelves alongside the flour and the canning jars. Convenience foods, boxed cake mixes, canned soup for casseroles, and eventually the first frozen dinners began sharing counter space with the same fat can and the same sour milk pitcher a Depression-era mother had raised her daughter to keep. That tension is really what defines the decade in the kitchen. Two generations of habit sat on the same counter at the same time, the inherited scarcity wisdom of a mother who lived through rationing and the shiny new promise of a cake mix that only needed an egg. Neither one fully won. They simply learned to share the shelf. By the very end of the decade, a shift in tone had crept into women's magazines. Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, and McCall's had spent years teaching readers how to stretch what they already had. Increasingly, the same pages began teaching readers how to best use the new convenience products arriving on shelves. The lesson was slowly changing from thrift to consumption. None of this means the old tricks disappeared overnight. They simply retreated to the places convenience took longest to reach: rural households, immigrant kitchens, and the homes of Depression-generation grandmothers who kept teaching them quietly to grandchildren, whether or not the rest of the country was still listening. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. That line applies to almost everything in this video, but nowhere more than the grease can. There is nothing dangerous about straining and reusing rendered fat with ordinary food safety sense, keeping it covered, using it within a reasonable stretch of time, and refrigerating it if it sits for a while. A Sunday roast in a 1950s kitchen was never really one meal. It was 3 or 4. The bird or the pot roast fed the family Sunday night, the leftover meat went into a hash or a pie by Tuesday, and the bones went straight into a stock pot with an onion and a carrot end, simmered slowly until every bit of flavor had been pulled out into a broth that cost nothing but time. That stock pot habit is quietly one of the smartest tricks in this whole video. A carcass that costs nothing, simmered for hours, turns into a base for soup, gravy, or rice that would otherwise require buying broth outright. It sounds almost too simple to matter, and that is exactly why it disappeared. Convenience broth in a can made the whole ritual feel unnecessary. Wilting vegetables were not a lost cause either. A limp carrot or a soft head of celery went straight into the stock pot or a Monday soup pot rather than the bin, because a 1950s kitchen understood that flavor and nutrition did not vanish the moment a vegetable stopped looking picture perfect on the counter. Only true spoilage, not mere softness, earned a trip to the trash. Eggshells did double duty beyond the garden. A crushed shell dropped into a pot of coffee grounds while brewing was a common trick to settle the grounds and smooth out bitterness in a percolator, long before paper filters became standard in most American homes. It was a small, strange-looking habit that quietly worked. Butter was expensive enough in many households that it was stretched too, not just meat. Mixing softened butter with a little milk and beating it to double its volume, sometimes called whipped or stretched butter, let a smaller block cover more toast and more biscuits across a week without anyone noticing much difference at the table. Potato peels, apple cores, and other trimmings from a big cooking day were rarely tossed without a second thought. In households with chickens or a compost pile, they went straight back into the food cycle. In households without either, they still often ended up boiled down for a simple vegetable stock rather than discarded outright. Ice cube trays did more than chill a drink. Leftover coffee, small amounts of broth, or extra tomato sauce were sometimes frozen in ice trays once home freezers became common in the mid to late 1950s, giving a homemaker portioned, ready-to-use bits of flavor she would otherwise have poured down the drain rather than store for one meal's worth of use. A well-seasoned cast iron skillet was treated less like a tool and more like a family member. It was never scrubbed hard with soap, only wiped clean and lightly oiled, because a 1950s cook understood that the seasoning built up over years of cooking was doing real work, keeping food from sticking and adding its own quiet flavor to every meal cooked in it. That single skillet often outlived the woman who seasoned it, passed down to a daughter or granddaughter decades later, still cooking, still carrying a surface built one meal at a time. Compare that to how often a non-stick pan gets replaced today, and the 1950s approach starts to look less old-fashioned and more like the original sustainable kitchen tool. Flour sacks themselves were part of the frugal cycle. Cotton flour and feed sacks in this era were often printed with cheerful patterns, specifically so homemakers could sew them into dish towels, aprons, and even children's clothing once the flour was used, a detail that sounds almost unbelievable now, but was simply common sense at the time. Manufacturers noticed this habit and leaned into it, printing flour sacks in floral and gingham patterns specifically to appeal to homemakers who planned to repurpose the fabric. It is a rare case of a big company actually adapting its product to support a thrift habit rather than trying to sell a version that discouraged it. Bread that had gone properly stale past the point of French toast was not wasted either. It was dried fully and ground into fine crumbs, stored in a jar for weeks, ready to coat a piece of chicken or thicken a meatloaf whenever it was needed. That jar of crumbs meant never having to buy a box of them from the store. Coffee itself was often stretched too, especially in leaner households. A scoop of chicory root, roasted and ground, was mixed into the coffee grounds before brewing, a practice with deep roots in the American South going back generations, letting a smaller amount of actual coffee brew a full pot without tasting noticeably weak. Sugar, once tightly rationed during the war, stayed something to use carefully even after the ration books disappeared. Recipes leaned on corn syrup, molasses, or simply less sugar than modern versions call for, and desserts were often smaller and less sweet than what fills a bakery case today, a genuine difference in the American palate this decade helped shape. Leftover vegetables from more than one dinner were often combined into a single dish rather than served again on their own, sometimes called a icebox stew or a hodgepodge, where whatever remained in small amounts through the week got simmered together into something new by Friday. It turned a scattering of small leftovers into an actual meal instead of a string of half portions. Canning was not limited to fruit for jam. Vegetables, meats, and even soups were pressure canned at home, following careful USDA guidelines on processing times and temperatures that extension offices published, and homemakers followed closely, because getting it wrong carried real risk. This was serious, technical kitchen work, not a casual hobby. A pressure canner in a 1950s kitchen was treated with real respect, almost like a piece of machinery rather than a pot, because a homemaker of this era understood that a mistake in the canning process could spoil an entire summer's worth of preserved food, or worse. Getting it right was a point of quiet pride passed carefully from mother to daughter. Onion and garlic skins, along with other aromatic vegetable scraps, were sometimes saved in a bag in the freezer specifically to build stock later, a habit that meant a homemaker never needed to buy a fresh onion just to flavor a pot of soup. The freezer, once it arrived in most kitchens, became a second pantry for scraps as much as for finished food. Casseroles rose to popularity in this decade for a reason beyond convenience. A single baking dish could combine a small amount of meat, a starch like rice or noodles, a canned or homegrown vegetable, and a binding sauce into one dish that stretched across several servings and reheated well the next day, making it one of the most efficient thrift tools a kitchen had. The rise of canned cream soup as a casserole binder in the mid-1950s is often mocked today, but it solved a real problem. It replaced a homemade white sauce that took time and careful attention, letting a busy homemaker assemble a stretched, filling dinner in a fraction of the time without giving up the basic thrift logic of the dish itself. Leftover coffee was sometimes used in baking too, added to chocolate cake batter to deepen the flavor without adding real cost, since it was already sitting cold in the percolator from breakfast. It is a trick still used by serious bakers today, though most home cooks now buy fresh coffee for that purpose, instead of reaching for what is already on the stove. Dish soap and washing powder were used sparingly, often diluted more than the label suggested, because a bottle was expected to last far longer than modern households typically stretch one. A little went a long way, and a homemaker who ran out early in the week before payday was considered to have managed poorly, not unluckily. Candle stubs, soap slivers, and other small household leftovers were often melted down and reformed rather than thrown away once they got too small to use comfortably, a habit that extended the same waste-nothing logic from the kitchen into the rest of the house. The kitchen was simply where this mindset was strongest and best documented. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. Homemade salad dressing, usually a simple oil and vinegar shaken together with a little sugar, mustard, and salt, cost pennies compared to a bottled version and kept for weeks in the icebox. Bottled dressing did not truly dominate American refrigerators until well after this decade ended. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Even wax paper and butcher paper from the grocer were smoothed out and reused for wrapping sandwiches or covering a bowl in the icebox, rather than replaced with a fresh sheet each time, because paper itself, cheap as it seems now, still cost real money against a tight weekly budget. Church and community cookbooks, often mimeographed and stapled together by local women's groups, were quietly one of the biggest sources of thrift recipes in this decade, trading tested, budget-stretching dishes between neighbors long before any national magazine reached the same households. Many of these small, local books never made it into any archive at all. That kind of neighbor-to-neighbor recipe sharing meant the very best thrift tricks in any given town rarely stayed a secret for long. If one woman found a way to make $1 of ground beef feed 6 people well, it showed up in someone else's kitchen within a season, carried by word of mouth and a borrowed recipe card rather than any national trend. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching. Measuring by feel rather than by exact recipe was common among experienced cooks of this era, a pinch here and a handful there, built on years of repetition rather than a printed card. It made recipes flexible enough to absorb whatever the pantry actually had that week, rather than demanding an exact ingredient list. That flexibility is part of why so many of these dishes vanished from modern kitchens. They resist a clean, precise recipe card because they were never meant to be exact. A modern cook trained on precise measurements can find dishes like this frustrating to follow, even though the underlying skill they represent is arguably more advanced, not less. This is exactly why so much of this knowledge simply vanished when it wasn't written down carefully. A trick that lived entirely in a woman's hands and habits could disappear within a single generation if her daughter moved away, married into a different kind of household, or simply had less time to stand and learn beside her at the stove. Some of these tricks survived only because a handful of women wrote them down anyway, in the margins of a cookbook, on the back of a recipe card, or in a letter to a daughter who had moved across the country. Those scattered scraps of paper are, in a very real sense, the primary historical record this entire video draws from. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget. Vintage cookbooks, community pamphlets, and extension bulletins from this decade are still findable today in secondhand shops, in estate sales, and in library archives, quietly waiting for anyone curious enough to open them and see exactly how a 1950s household actually stretched its food and its money. None of this is a suggestion to abandon modern kitchens or modern food safety knowledge. It is simply a reminder that a generation of women solved real budget problems with real skill, using tools no more exotic than cheesecloth, a coffee can, and a sharp sense of smell. And that skill deserves more credit than it usually gets. The Great Recession, beginning in 2008, brought the first real modern wave of interest in these kitchen habits. Canning, scratch cooking, and stretching a pound of meat across a week suddenly mattered to families who had never needed to think about it before, and grandmother's old tricks started sounding less quaint and a lot more practical. A second larger wave arrived during 2020 when home baking and sourdough starters became a national pastime almost overnight, and canning jar lids briefly grew hard to find in stores. Victory garden nostalgia showed up in newspapers again, 80 years after the original gardens were planted, because the same underlying instinct had returned: grow it, preserve it, waste nothing. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Grocery prices have stayed noticeably elevated through the first half of this decade, and that pressure has done exactly what the ration books and the post-war budgets once did. It has sent people looking backward toward the same habits a 1953 kitchen already had perfected. What today's food writers call a zero-waste kitchen, or root-to-stem cooking, is in most cases simply the relabeled version of what extension bulletins were teaching in 1955. The vocabulary is new. The instinct underneath it, using every part of every ingredient before it goes to waste, is exactly the same one your grandmother carried without ever needing a hashtag for it. A pound of dried beans in this decade cost only a fraction of what a pound of meat did, and a resourceful homemaker leaned on that gap deliberately, building whole dinners around beans, lentils, and split peas stretched with just enough ham hock or bacon for flavor, rather than built around meat as the main event the way modern plates so often are. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching. It was never really about nostalgia for her. It was about control, the quiet confidence of knowing exactly how far a dollar and a pound of meat could stretch, and never once feeling powerless in her own kitchen no matter what the grocery bill said that week. None of these tricks required money, and that is really the point worth sitting with. A grease can, a stock pot of bones, a jar of dried breadcrumbs, and a sharp sense of smell cost nothing beyond the time it took to build the habit. Every single one of them is still available to anyone willing to pick the habit back up today, exactly as it was left. So the next time a carton of milk turns a little sooner than expected, or a skillet is left with a spoonful of drippings in the bottom, it is worth remembering that a whole generation of American kitchens looked at exactly that moment and saw an ingredient, not an ending. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and it is not too late to remember with it. Thank you for spending this time in a kitchen that mostly exists in memory now. If a family recipe or a saved trick like this one has been passed down in your own house, I would love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more of these forgotten kitchen stories, stay close. There is always more hiding in what nobody thought to save.